everybody. Webinar number 3 of Saturday, May 23rd. A very important one. We have Coach Will back from Rowing Stronger, and thank you for joining us, Will, and thank you also for changing so closely to the date, changing your presentation to something that is immediate, and that is everybody's in a hurry to get back to the boathouses. Everybody's in a hurry to train. And so we thought, when you and I spoke, I don't know, 2 weeks ago or a week and a half ago, how appropriate would it be for us to start talking about, okay, we've had a couple weeks, couple months layoff, like we need to be careful getting back after it, too hard, too much, too soon. So, so glad to have you back, and I'm going to get out of your way, so feel free.
All right, great. Well, thanks for having me back on and for the intro. Yeah, let me switch over to share my screen here. All right, hold on. All right, and so like as you may have heard, this is now return to row considerations, not the hip hinge and the YWT raise. Hopefully we'll to cover that another time. But yeah, thanks to everybody for joining us on this holiday afternoon. Where are we at here? Like 56, 60 people is more than I expected. It's our first summer weekend here in Vermont. So I'm going to keep this tight, and then we can all get back to our barbecues or otherwise enjoying our weekend. If your social media experience is anything like mine, the last 2 weeks have been just nonstop pictures of single scullers and small boats rejoicing in the return to on-water rowing. So U.S. Rowing and most of the other national governing organizations have all put out position statements on the COVID-19 logistical side of making this work. And so what I'm going to talk about today is the rowing specific side of safely returning to rowing once we're actually on the water. So like Chris said, after a couple months or 8+ weeks, whatever we are at now, away from specific training, even if you've been able to keep up on erging, this is still a transitionatory period that we need to treat carefully on how we progress volume, intensity, and frequency with the return. So I want to say just a few things about my background and qualifications before we get going, as my perspective frames the presentation material. So importantly, I am not a medical professional, public policy expert, or physical therapist. For the purposes of this presentation, I am a strength coach with a library card. Very little of the material that I'm going to present today is my own original thought. The return to train phase is heavily studied in the strength and conditioning field, and we're fortunate to be able to draw further from a lot of great rowing specific research conducted by some very smart rowing scholars, coaches, and clinicians. So what I'm going to present today is a summary of key points from both fields and how this guides my coaching practice and takeaways that you might draw upon in planning your own situation. So this is not medical advice. I will not be talking about COVID-19 specific logistics or anything under the domain of medical professionals. I'll talk about injuries generally, but if you have a question about returning to row given a specific injury or specific individual situation, please email me afterwards and I can refer you to multiple rowing physical therapists I know who are doing remote consultations. Chris, Cam, either of you might have resources to share there as well. It's not something that I'm personally informed on or qualified to speak to, but what I can speak to is general principles to reduce risk of injury, identifying known risks based on training research and evidence-based strategies to reduce those risks. So everyone will have a different individual situation. Local timelines are different, individual boathouse or individual rower situations are different, and teams won't even have the chance to come back until fall, if then. So my goal today is just to lay out the research and the general principles and guidelines so that you can figure out how best to apply them to your own individual situation. This is the essence of evidence-based practice and why I have this slide here. So let's take the best available research and put it together with our coaching or training experience, and our knowledge of our specific context and situation, and then give us the best chance possible at success. So this is the evidence-based practice approach to the return to train, as we'll get into this more. So what I hope you get out of it today is an understanding of injury risks and why we need to be especially careful around all transitional phases, but especially the present post-shutdown transition, and specific strategies to consider when you personally or your team is able to return to rowing and strength training. The comparison of what is done with what is prepared for is a line from a research piece we'll cover, and a central idea in return to train planning overall. What are you doing and how have you prepared to do it? So we talk about frequency, volume, and intensity. Here's what we are talking about specifically. Frequency, number of times in a given period of training a specific quality. So we might say that our overall training frequency is 10 sessions a week, but we could get more granular and break that down further with, okay, we've got 8 sessions a week of rowing, we got 2 sessions a week of erging, we got 2 sessions a week of strength training. Whatever it is, you could break it down how you want. That's the general idea of frequency. Volume, number of meters or minutes in a given time period. Rowing is more quantifiable than most other sports because we've got the damn meter count on every erg piece, or now with all the technology, we've got the rowing pieces too. So it's easy to track meters. Some of the research from other sports is going to be around minutes or hours of training. And that's all just a measure of volume, basically how much work are we doing in either time or meters. Intensity, percentage of effort. So we might measure that with either heart rate or rate of perceived exertion, or lactate, or whatever method you want. Basically, the higher intensity, the higher percentage of effort. But we can also talk about per stroke loading there. So how much sort of load are we moving on each stroke? And I'll get into that more as we go. And then I've got a quote here from a 2016 meta-analysis on rowing injuries, identifying rapid increases in these training factors as the largest risk of rowing injury. The rapid increases tend to occur during transitional phases. So I'll use sort of return to train and transitional phases fairly interchangeably. We have an obvious transitional phase right now with the post-shutdown reopenings, but these windows exist in the regular year too. And so I think that if we can use the COVID-19, post-shutdown return as like a very obvious example, that's a learning opportunity for a lot of people who may not have been tuned into these other transitional phases in the rest of the year, and that we can maybe use this learning to transfer over to regular, post-pandemic training, and hopefully cut down on rowing injuries. So obviously, again, today talking about returning to rowing and or strength training, because we've got gyms reopening too after the shutdown. But really, it's any time that we're transitioning from relative inactivity to routine training. So that could be vacation, or if you're on a scholastic calendar, academic recess, final exams, if you have that week off and then you return the next week, that would be a transitional phase. If you're returning from injury, let's say you've been cleared by a physical therapist, but there's always that gap in between, okay, I'm cleared by a physical therapist, I can physically return to sport training, but you're not at full performance yet. That would be a transitional window too. Transitioning between land and on water training. So for those of us who freeze over and have a phase of solely on land training and then go back to on water, that's a transitional phase. Training camps and other phases of increased training, also a transitional phase. So if we go from just training once a day or twice a day on normal day, and then we go to a training camp and we go to 3 to 4 times a day, that's a transitional phase too. So we've got to be aware of those phases. And then one that people might not think about is making a significant change in technique or equipment. So that will come back in some of the research that I go over. But if you make basically a major change there, then we've got to give the muscular and skeletal structures time to catch up, even though your aerobic fitness hasn't changed. One Key point two is new coach or new staff or new athletes. So if you're again on a scholastic calendar and you've got first year athletes coming in or transfer athletes, those athletes are all in basically a transitional or return to train phase two, not having an exact idea of what they were doing before and what they're prepared to do. So again, the comparison of what is done with what is prepared for applies in all of these situations beyond just the current extreme example of the COVID-19 shutdown. And here's sort of why. Ergs don't float. So all these transitional times, no matter how well and how aerobically fit you are, I hope that this picture shows that this is a really different action around the shoulder and the rib cage than our sculler here getting out into that nice hug the horizon position, or our sweep rower here with getting some great thoracic rotation. So I've been posting this picture on social media for the last couple of weeks to sort of try to prove this point. Your aerobic fitness might be the best ever, but your shoulders and your ribs and your upper spine is not the same between these three conditions. So this is a risk because you might feel like you can go full bore, but those small structures can get overtrained, injured, generally overstressed. The other key point for rowing for why these transitional phases are such a risk is that we have essentially very little traumatic injury in rowing. Pretty much all of rowing injuries are overuse injuries. It's not a contact sport. We don't have any jarring impact like a misplanted foot for an ACL tear or a slip on the grass for a wrist sprain. You know, as long as you're careful about getting boats in and out of the house, that's really our main opportunity for traumatic injury. So on one hand, this should be empowering because coaches and athletes have direct control over injury mechanism and risk of injuries, but it's also defeating another way because the evidence shows that we're not really doing a good job with managing that. This is one rowing study that did a prospective analysis. So in a retrospective analysis, they will issue a survey and it'll be based on, you know, memory and accurate records, which is sort of hit or miss. A prospective study, they follow the researchers follow along with the athletes for the entire study time. So that's the gold standard in injury analysis because we can actually see what's going on and record it in real time. Then these researchers found a higher injury rate in rowers than even some contact sports. And so I've highlighted these lines here where they compare, you know, none of the injuries reported happened during competition. And so they've compared injury rates to other sports that have a really high amount of training time per a relatively small competitive time. And that's sort of how it stacks up. So we're doing this to ourselves with excessive training volume, intensity, or too rapid of a progression in either. This is a 2015 study of 76 team New Zealand rowers over 12 months of training. Researchers found that low back pain incidence was significantly related to training volume in terms of total hours and total kilometers per month, and previous history of injury as another factor. So basically, once you get one injury, it's more likely to get another. So we've got to break this cycle by reducing risks in the first place to cut down on the first incidence of injury, so that then we can cut down on future injury and overall. This is a particularly telling graph from their analysis. The gray bars are the total training hours per month. So across the whole team, so all 76 athletes, here's their total training time. And then the blue line is the new low back injuries. So note here this huge spike in September to October. That's what, at least a triple increase in total training workload between September and October, and almost exactly a triple increase as well in low back injuries. Here's a study from Team Australia. And one more thing I wanted to say about this is note that this was not zero training, right? This is still between all 76 athletes, over 1,000 hours of training in September. So even those who have been doing some training during a break are again at risk of injury from an excessively rapid return to train phase, which making a triple increase in the first month back certainly is. So Team Australia did another study. This is 151 Team Australia rowers during the 2012 to 2016 Olympic training cycle. And I'm not just picking on those down under. So sorry, Cam, but this just happens to be where the research is coming from on this, as far as like really tight prospective analyses looking at rowing injuries and correlating it really well to workload and rowing specific training metrics. So these researchers found that 32%, which was 6 total, of the rib stress injuries occurred during return to train phases of training camps or the week after time away from training. So more than 1 to 2 weeks away from training, rowers come back. That's when 32% of their rib stress injuries occurred. And 26%, which was 5 of the cases, occurred in the week following a significant change in technique or a sweep rower switching boat sides. So again, aerobic fitness, exactly the same. Lower body, pretty much exactly the same. But the difference in reaching one way versus reaching the other, and the thoracic rotation that comes along with that, is a totally new stress and puts too much on the musculoskeletal structures if we don't give the rest of that time to catch up with everything else. They also note here that the median time to return to full on water training was 69 days for a full fracture and 57 days for just a reaction. Those are sort of the 2 gradations of rib stress injuries, the catch-all term, and then we can go into full fractures, the most severe, and then a reaction is less severe, where it still hurts and still interferes with training, but doesn't show up on bone imaging as a full fracture. So the median time was 69 days for full fracture and 57 days for a reaction. No athlete returned to training after sustaining a fracture before 51 days, and all returned before 167 days. So for athletes with a rib stress reaction, the quickest was 24 days, and all athletes returned to training before 97 days. But that's still a huge amount of time. So what I wanted to show with this is that you rush back, you put a ton of load on the athletes early on, either through a training camp or through a return phase, or through not making an adjustment when you ask a big technical change or a switch of sides. And that athlete is out for a minimum of 3 weeks based on this study if you get away with just a rib stress reaction. The issue is, I mean, as a strength coach, I think that all injuries are sort of equally valuable, or all athletes are equally valuable. All injuries are equally disastrous. But if that's, your best rower who you rush back because, we don't have time, we've got to get it back quickly, and then that athlete's out for 3+ weeks with an injury, what good have you really done yourself there? This one's going to take a little bit of explaining, but I think it's a cool study, and so I wanted to talk about it here. This was not from rowing. The previous 2 were on rowing specifically, and this is the last sort of the 3 studies that I'm going to cover. They analyzed data in studies that they had done before on cricket, rugby, and Australian rules football. So again, not an endurance sport, not rowing. How much can we generalize this? I think that we can look at it in a general principle and draw some takeaways here. And so they produced this chart looking at injury rates at different workloads. So this was the ratio of acute to chronic workload. Chronic workload is the athlete's average training hours over the prior 4 weeks, and acute workload is the training hours for one specific week. So this is all, and I've got an example on the next slide where I'm going to walk through this with a specific example. This is all based off of like your normal baseline value. Then your chronic workload is your 4 weeks basically after that, and then acute workload is the first week back. Both are expressed as percentages of the normal workload. So to go for the rowing example here, let's say your pre-shutdown training amount was 12 hours a week. So let's say you do two hours a day, 6 hours, or 6 days a week is 12 hours total. That's your 100% number that will base chronic and acute workload off of. So that's your baseline. Then during the shutdown, or during the 4 weeks, or during the 2 weeks, or whatever of your time away from sport, you did 1 hour a day, still 6 days a week. So that's 6 hours a week. 50% is your chronic. So we're going to be looking at this row here for your chronic workload. I've got 3 different options basically for 3 different return to row strategies, and how we can use this data to, again, speculatively just look at what the injury risks are. So let's say in the first one, you go right back to what you were doing before. You go to an acute workload of 100%, 12 hours a week, right? Just go back to what you were doing before. That puts you here at a 14.9% injury rate. So if you've got a team of 30 rowers and you put them all right back to what they were doing before, that's roughly 5 of your athletes. In our second option, we go, oh, we got to make up for lost time. We're doing a training camp. We're going to add extra volume, extra sessions. We go to 16 hours a week. So again, off of our chronic workload of 50% for the last 4 weeks, we've been doing 6 hours a week. Now we're going to 120%, and that's 25% injury rate on this. So that's 7 to 8 of your 30 athletes, based on the results of this study, likely to get injured. And then in option C, let's say we make just a progressive increase. We go from 6 hours a week to 7 hours a week. That's going from 50% to 70%. And so that's 5.5 is our injury rate. One to 2 athletes per 30, roughly in line with sort of known risks of just doing a competitive activity anyway. They have this color gradation system here. You make your own determination for what is an appropriate risk in your own individual coaching or training situation. So just a couple notes on this design overall. They did not break down specific injuries. They also didn't break this down into specific kinds of workloads. So they've done this in some studies where they said, okay, this athlete was doing, it was a cricket study, and they were studying bowlers or pitchers. Sorry, I don't know anything about cricket. And they said, okay, this athlete was doing this many throws at this intensity. So then they correlated it to RPE. We could do similar in rowing too, but no studies exist on this yet. And then they can look at injury rates as a function of how much intense work the athlete is doing. So in this study, they just took the averages overall. So this is just total hours and total injuries, just compared straight across the board. Want to note a couple additional
concerns? That would be
yeah.
balls, by the way. You were
I'm
correct.
sorry?
That would be balls.
Okay. Good. I'm glad to have your knowledge for that unique sport. So I'll note a couple additional concerns here, and then I'll pause for questions before I move into strategies, in case anybody has questions about the sort of trail of evidence and research. So in addition, I've focused most of my rowing specific work on low back pain and rib stress injuries. Those are sort of the two most common and most severe injuries. There's obviously other injuries too. Wrist, elbow, shoulder, knee, basically anything with a joint can go wrong. But I just focused on those two specifically. We've got some additional concerns with this time too. The world is warmer now than it was when we went into the shutdown. So we have to worry about some additional things with return training. So sudden cardiac death, this is all coming from the National Strength Conditioning Association's joint consensus statement on transition periods. They published his position statement following the high-profile deaths of student athletes in NCAAs, mostly football. And they said, all right, we've got to get information out about this because there's too many problems happening, especially in transition periods, either coming back from a break, coming back into summer training. And so they produced this document, which has been really helpful and something we're going to draw a lot on in the strategies. So they focused this on sudden cardiac death, exertional heat illness, and exertional rhabdomyolysis. And I want to break down a few of these. Sudden cardiac death is the leading cause of death in NCAA athletes, which is a shocking statistic. Sudden cardiac death in otherwise healthy athletes occurs when an underlying cardiorespiratory vulnerability is triggered by a traumatic stimulus. So the NSCA authors indicate that screening athletes for underlying heart defects is a crucial step, but that all coaches and athletes, regardless of your situation, let's say you don't have the opportunity to do intensive screening procedures, take caution during the transitional phase to safely increase training and avoid creating that traumatic stimulus in the first place. So if we don't know what potential underlying causes might be happening, then let's just avoid turning the stress up to 11 all of a sudden, because that's where the traumatic risk comes in. Exertional heat illness ranges from everything from muscle cramps to heat exhaustion and heat stroke. The heat illnesses can occur in any athletic setting, but are especially common in the first 5 to 6 days of unaccustomed heat exposure before athletes can acclimatize to the new environment. So this presents a high risk during return to train activities, especially the preseason training camps. So, and again, let's think, especially right now, if you've been indoors or you've been not out on the water in the sun, then that's a risk, especially in those first 5 to 6 days. Exertional rhabdomyolysis is rhabdo for short. As you may have heard about it, there have been, again, some very high profile student athlete cases on this. It occurs when a muscle or muscular area is exposed to such high trauma that the body basically determines that it is toxic and begins breaking down the skeletal muscle and excreting it. The excretion process occurs through the kidneys and urinary system, which then exposes the kidneys to high damage because it's a ton of direct muscular tissue basically going through them, high damage and risk of total failure. They can have to put athletes on dialysis for this. So there have been low levels of fitness and then excessive amounts of especially repetitive exercise are major risk factors for rhabdo. There have been several incidents of this in athletic populations. In a January 2011 workout, University of Iowa football players fresh off of winter break were subjected to 100 squats at 50% of their 1 rep max in as little time as possible. And they had 13 athletes hospitalized with rhabdo, and several more experienced significant symptoms without hospitalization. So again, really high repetitive load coming off of detrained athletes, major problem for this. Risk factor for rowing too, as a repetitive movement. It's not just a football problem. In 2007, they had a new swim coach. Again, transition phases with the new athlete, the new coach, brought a tough tester of a workout to the athletes, 10 minutes straight of 60-second max reps on push-ups and unweighted squats. So 60 seconds one, 60 seconds the other, 10 minutes straight, followed by a brutal swimming workout, and then repeated for 3 consecutive days. So they had 7 athletes hospitalized with rhabdo around that. So, and then also, of course, COVID-19 too. So we've got all of that kind of to be aware of. So this is a super important phase, both the rowing specific injuries and the general health concerns. And then also we've got all the COVID stuff to deal with too. So now that I've piled a ton of logistical things on this, I hope I've sort of laid a track for why this phase is a particularly vulnerable time. And then we'll go into strategies next, but I'll pause for any questions first.
Hey, Will, I think we're good. The only question here is,
for the moment. Yeah.
Whoa. What you got?
yeah, there's no question here. It's just one for us to get some slides out. So I think you're good to go from,
Okay.
unless you have one.
Yeah. No, you go ahead. Will,
Cool.
you're right on.
Keep it rolling. All right. So the first thing we need to do is identify our return windows. So again, they're going to get the slides out. They'll be able to get you the list of like all the return opportunities, but just think anytime you make a significant change, what has been done, what is prepared for. So we can just go through our training year and identify times coming back from academic recess, times coming back from vacation. Anytime we're going from decreased training and potential detraining status to increased training, that's a transition time. Anytime we're making a significant change, going from ergs to on water, going from skull to sweep, sweep to skull, whatever it is, those are all transition times. So the first thing we can do is just identify those and be aware of those, again, beyond the COVID-19 shutdown. Next thing that we can do is assessments. So this is particularly important from the NSCA document to get an idea of where athletes are at coming back from a phase away from training. So we can evaluate mental and physical health. Looking, somebody who has lost a job or experienced injury or had a stressful time away is going to respond differently than somebody who's just been sitting at home in their sweatpants, working away, watching Netflix and erging during the shutdown. So we've got to know roughly where athletes are at so that we can program appropriately when we return from training. We can also look at physical health. So body composition is a big one, especially over the length of shutdown that we've had. how in shape are athletes? What do we need to be worried about as potential risk factors as we return to training? If movement or mobility screens are part of your regular training practice pre-shutdown or pre-time away, then that's really great to have a baseline of their trained status. And then, okay, now we've come back from a detraining phase. Now we're going to return. We can do a baseline, see if there's any issues. If an athlete has restricted hip flexors because they sat down in uncomfortable positions working from home for 8 weeks of the shutdown, my physical therapist friends in rowing are doing a ton of consultations for people working from home, coming up with odd aches and pains that didn't occur before, but that could be traced back to working in an uncomfortable working environment, or just new positions. So we can look at those. Those are, again, going to be risk factors for injury. If the hip flexors are really limited, the athlete, in order to achieve full reach in the stroke, is going to overcompensate either from the spine or from the shoulders. So if we can identify that as a risk factor, treat it appropriately, and then get the athlete back up to full speed. I believe that rigorous, strenuous erg tests should not be a part of a return to train assessment. I've coached rowing. I've been a strength coach for a college program. I understand very well the frustration of athletes taking break too seriously. And I understand the temptation of wanting to schedule a barn burner of an erg workout, or 3K test that's going to determine your ranking, whatever, when they return from training. That motivator might work for some people who are first able to stay up on training, and then for those who are willing to stay up on training. But I don't think that an appropriate punishment is injury or increased risk of injury for not taking training seriously during a breakaway. So I know that if we use submaximal testing instead, we can still get good data as part of our assessments on where athlete fitness is at, but without subjecting athletes to mental and physical increased strain, risk of injury, long-term performance problems. Again, if we rush athletes back week 1, let's see who's been doing it, and I get 5 of my athletes injured, that's going to be hard to put boats together later in the season if not all of them are able to come back swiftly. So again, let's question, like, what is the actual purpose of this, and is this an asymmetrical risk of, yeah, okay, we'll get people trained up, but we also might injure people with an aggressive return testing protocol. So we could use some maximal tests, again, to get good fitness data, get specific information on their specific rowing fitness. But if you use, like, let's say you do the 30-minute at 20 rate 30R20 test as your return test, consider heart rate capping that so that it's not 30 minutes of total max at low rate, which is a increased per stroke load. Cap it with a heart rate test, so that basically all athletes are working at a sub-maximal point. You can still look at the total meters. This still gives us valuable information about who's been training, who's been taking this seriously, and who's ready to go. But it doesn't subject the athlete to total maximal effort, high stress and strain on muscular and skeletal tissues that may not be ready to go. You could also do a 15R20 test. Just take the volume in half. You're still going to know where the fitness is, but it's just not going to be to the prolonged level and the total maximal effort of a 30-minute test. So there's any number of ways you could do that. There could be some brainstorming on that too, as far as, like, how you use a sub-maximal fitness test to still get good information. You could use a vertical jump test or a 10-stroke test, right? Like, all those are relatively low injury risk. Still gives us good data as part of an overall assessment without saying it's a 2K, we're ranking you based on this, so do or die no matter what you've prepared for over the last week, 2 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever it is, of detraining. And I've got 2 links here for what if you had COVID-19 during the shutdown. Again, I'm not a medical professional. I'm not talking about those specifically, but I've got really good information here from the British Journal of Sports Medicine on the extreme importance of doing electrocardiogram testing, because we know that whatever affects the lungs, a respiratory virus, also is going to affect the heart, which has to get blood flow to really stressed tissues. And we know that rowing subjects a lot of stress on both of those. And so we don't know how long lasting the coronavirus effects are going to be. Yeah. So really important, both of these resources. And there's a podcast that goes with the top one too. This author is based out of a University of Washington lab, and did a podcast discussing it with like a couple different situations of, okay, mild case of coronavirus, severe case of coronavirus, what testing is available to you, how he's doing it with the athletes that he coaches. So I really recommend looking into those two if you've either had the illness or if you're coaching or working with those who have. Cam, what's up?
Will, anything in the literature that speaks to the ratio of length of time detraining and then the return back to training?
As far as like if you've been detrained for 8 weeks, what are the injury rates compared to if you've detrained for 1 to 2? Yeah, unfortunately, no. The general definition of return to train is just more than a week away from training. So we're not talking about a long weekend, but sort of going into a week or longer. And so far, all the research has just kind of lumped all of those in with one. There was a study, and I should have included this with it. Maybe I could send it to you guys to send it out afterwards, that looked at the detraining of, I think it was another Kiwi actually, of a rower from the Olympic cycle. So they quantified all the training leading up to the Olympics, and then he took like 6 weeks off or 8 weeks off or something post Olympics, and then they tracked his return to train phase afterwards. They did it really well with progressive increases and gradual testing, body composition evaluation, all that stuff. So it's just one athlete. How much can we really draw from that? But that was like a 6 to 8 week time off. And then with how his performance rebounded over the following 6 months or 9 months, whatever the study period was. But yeah, I haven't seen much else in terms of like, this is an unprecedented situation of 8 weeks of gym shutdowns as well as boathouse shutdowns. So again, this is return to train, turn to 11 in this case is a really extreme example, but we can be aware of these times through the rest of the training year too.
I think that's a good comparison, where between 6 to 8 weeks off, it's not an immediate return to something familiar. And to your point about the testing, there's also a question here about appropriate testing, which I think you touched on, of looking at submaximal ways of assessing what has occurred during the detraining period, if you want to call it that, and then systematically increasing both load, intensity, frequency as you go along. That there's probably, for every athlete, there's a different reaction, and particularly what has occurred during the detraining. It's as much of a question of what you've done during the detraining as it is of what you do in the return. So I think that's really helpful. Thank you.
Yep. And so again, that's where like the complete assessment comes in. It's not just an erg test, but it's the erg test, it's the specific growing information plus the mental and physical health, whether that's questionnaire or just having a conversation, whatever that is, any movement or mobility screenings that you could do to get a baseline before the detraining phase. And then after the detraining phase, we could put all of this together to get a sense of where the athletes are at, and then be able to train more progressively, more effectively with less risk of injury. Again, we know that rowing has a high injury rate compared to other non-contact sports and even contact sports. We know that the transition phases are a risk of injury. So how do we start to actually work with those to cut down overall injury rates in the sport? And that's where we go next into the strategies. So we've identified the windows, we've assessed the athletes before and after. Now we're talking about the specific specific strategies for returning to training. So this is again all coming from the NSCA document. There's no specific resources for rowing in terms of like how to do a return to train phase. I think that we can take the NSCA's general advice on conditioning training and aerobic training more broadly, and then apply that to rowing until we have more specific resources from rowing researchers or governing bodies on this. One key feature in this is minimizing overlap. So what rowing specific information tells us is that when we've got high training volume and high intensity and or high frequency, then we've got a problem. So in a training camp, we basically increase all three of those really quickly. And so that's the rapid progression in all three. Is we've jacked up our volume because now we're training 3 times a day instead of 1 or 2 or whatever. We've jacked up our intensity because we're doing more. Maybe we've jacked up our intensity with more intervals training, more tests, more high load work, low rate work, whatever it is. And then we've increased frequency too. So we've got to be aware of these overlap times. If we're doing high volume, can we A, build progressively? B, can we reduce intensity during this time too? So if you've got access to spoon blades, that's a lower per stroke load than hatchet blades. Can we switch to those for a few weeks while we build the volume up and then build the intensity up? If we're going to do a training camp style, can we just use low load training for this because we're going to be doing high volume, right? So we can balance these stressors out. A couple other sources of increased per stroke loading is a hatchet blades over spoon blades, doing a lot of low rate work, because when the boat is moving slower, the athletes have to lift a proportionally greater amount with each stroke. Using static ergs instead of dynamic ergs. I know the dynamic ergs or slides, whatever, aren't available to everybody, but we just know, again, like, let's identify that risk and then figure out how we can best put it into practice in our own situation based on our own values and limitations. And then obviously any added load work on that too. So if you're jacking the fan resistance up on ergs, or if you are doing added, bungees or cans or boat weights or rowing 8s by pairs, whatever it is, that's all increased per stroke loading. So if we're also doing high frequency or high volume with that, then we've got to be aware of the overlap there. Major risk factor for injury. Any additional rapid progression is just adding more to that. So onto the progression stuff. The NSCA proposes this as the 50, 30, 20, 10 rule. And so those are reductions in volume with each week, or percent reductions to percent increases. I much prefer to think of it as the 50, 70, 80, 90 rule, but whichever way you go, it's fine, as long as you can remember how to run the math yourself. So I've got an example here. If you've been doing 100 kilometers a week or 12 hours of training per week, two separate ideas, whether you're going to quantify in meters or quantify in hours, then week 1 is 50%. So again, that's our 50. So we're doing 50 kilometers or 6 hours total. Then the next week we go up to 70% of our 100%, or we go to our 30% reduction, 70 kilometers or 8.5 hours. So we're making just a small increase with each week. This is, again, no more than, you don't have to go straight to this amount, but the idea is we should not be going back to straight up 100% acute workloads within our first week back. So that's a 50, 30, 20, 10 rule. The NSCA proposes applying this to testing volumes as well as training volumes. So if the strength coach is overseeing the conditioning training or the conditioning testing, then that's basically going from the 30R20 to the 15R20 would be our 50% reduction. And then you can make your 30% reduction for your next test. If you wanted to retest athletes, you can apply this to testing volume as well as to your training volume. Fourth major strategy is to be aware of environmental factors with all of this. Again, we're trying to decrease risk of sudden cardiac death, exertional heat illness. So sun exposure, something we have to be aware of for rowing. It's bright out there. Again, things are warmer than they were 8 weeks ago before the shutdown. So if you were on the water before and then not on the water, we've got basically heat detraining occurring as well as potentially aerobic or muscular detraining. The heat, again, acclimatize gradually over 1 to 2 weeks. The first 5 to 6 days are the greatest risk of exertional heat illness, but it extends the window up to 1 to 2 weeks. So plan your rest breaks, plan your hydration ahead of time, adjust your work to rest ratio as necessary. Before we got on the call, we were talking about how we had 3 inches of snow 10 days ago here in central Vermont, and then today it was 80. But by the time I was doing my workout before the webinar, I trained in my uninsulated garage and or outside. So I feel it, whether it's 11 degrees outside as it was this winter, or whether it was 75 or 80 degrees. I know that doesn't sound that hot to a lot of you, but again, that 10-day sun shift, you bet I adjusted the heck out of my work to rest ratio for my strength training as well. So we can modify that as a way to decrease especially heart and cardiorespiratory stress on athletes. And then hydration and nutrition, again, just be particularly careful around supplements with dehydrating effects. So caffeine, creatine, alcohol is not really a supplement, but if you go out and enjoy your summertime the night before, then be aware of that as a hydration risk factor for when you are back on the water the next day. And then I do want to talk about strength training too, because we've got gyms reopening, or when we've got athletes returning from breaks away. This is going to be a factor for those coaching scholastic programs. Remember that we've got increased sensitivity or soreness with the novel stimulus of training. So delayed onset muscular soreness is that familiar soreness feeling from intense exercise that I'm sure we're all very familiar with. That increases anytime there's a novel stimulus. So if we change exercises rapidly, that's a novel stimulus. If we just add training rapidly, that's a novel stimulus. Anytime there's that change, brings increased sensitivity and soreness. So be aware of that as a factor. Progress athletes into this gradually. Again, there's also all the other potential stress and strain on the athletes. So this is the FIT rule, which takes into consideration frequency, intensity, and time of rest interval. So, and I've got a chart on this for the next slide to demonstrate how this actually comes together. The math on it's a little bit complicated, and I'm going to talk about potential workaround. So, the NSCA recommends that frequency not exceed 3 sessions per area of the body in the first return week. The vast majority of my strength training for rowers is on twice a week full body training. So we're going to stay under that anyway, but in case you're doing something different, the NSCA says to stay below 3 times a week for that first week back, and no more than 4 sessions in the second week. So again, we're making that progressive increase from week 1 to week 2. They then use the intensity relative volume system of quantifying training workloads, which is where the math gets a little bit complicated. It's a calculation of sets multiplied by reps, multiplied by the percent of 1 RM at which you are working. So that's my chart on the next one, is demonstrating this. And so they recommend that the IRV, which is that overall value, stay between 11 and 30 for the first 2 weeks of training. And then they recommend a 1 to 4 work to rest ratio in the first week of training and a 1 to 3 work to rest ratio in the second week of training. Again, to reduce risk of those major cardiorespiratory health concerns. Stay away from the rhabdomyolysis, super high repetition, repetitive movements, high stress and strain. So that would be like if you're doing 20 seconds of work, 1 to 4 would be 80 seconds of rest. And then on the next one, it'd be 20 seconds of work, 60 seconds of rest. And they say afterwards resume normal training, but in general, we should not be going like straight to 1-to-1 work to rest right after that. So here's how the IRV, intensity relative volume system works. Basically, they take your 3 sets, your 12 reps, multiply those, then multiply it with 0.65 as your percent of 1 RM you're working at. So if you're doing, say, squats, 3 sets of 12 with 65% of your 1 rep max would be a typical way to express that. Multiply all of those, and that's 23.4 IRV units. So that would be in the acceptable range of 11 to 30 within the first week. And we'll walk through all of these. They provide the obvious example of 10 sets of 10 repetitions at 50%. So that's our Iowa football program of 100 squats in as little time as possible with 50% of your 1 rep max. That's 50 IRV units, which is much too high, far beyond 30. So again, what the NSCA is trying to do is provide quantifiable marks so that strength coaches can either put these into practice themselves or work with sport coaches to say, no, here's what we're doing and here's why we're doing it. So this might be outside the mathematical feasibility of a lot of people listening to this. I think, based on my experience, that we could do a good job with using rate of perceived exertion, or RPE, which is useful when we might not have accurate percent 1 RMs to work with. Because if we've been out of the gym for 8+ weeks and now we're coming back, I don't know how much that 100% 1 rep max squat from before really applies to now. So what I've been doing with clients who are returning is really cutting the volume in half, basically, for the first week of whatever we were doing before, with the RPE, the rate of perceived exertion, at like a 6 or 7 out of 10. So each set feels like you could do 4 or 5 more reps. So if you're doing sets of 10, okay, it feels like I could have done 15. General idea is just starting out easier than you think you need to and building up from there. So again, we're comparing what we've prepared for and what we're doing. And we're just going to gradually rebuild, because it's an asymmetrical risk of how quickly do I need my squat 1 rep max to come back versus how much can I just make progressive increases, gradually build back to where I was. With no regattas coming up, I know we've got some virtual events, but with no major regattas coming up for the next calendar year or whatever, there's just no rush here. And so every one of these, like get it back as fast as possible, is an asymmetrical risk for putting yourself in pain and inconvenience by virtue of injury, but also putting yourself in medical resources, which I think we have an ethical responsibility to keep otherwise healthy athletes away from needing medical resources. Plus, for your own risk, the last place I want to be right now is a hospital or a doctor's office, unless I absolutely need to be there. So let's make smart progressive increases, not take those asymmetrical risks. Got my wrap up here on return to train notes, and I'm happy to take general questions on any of the principles. So again, we're comparing what is done with what is prepared for. We could do 50, 30, 20, 10 to close the gap between, okay, here's what I was doing before, here's what I would like to do now, close the gap in between those two. And then availability over ability is a general principle of having available athletes is better than having really highly able athletes, but not having much availability. So if we injure 50% of our team, but 50% is like really high functioning, I don't know if that's really worth the math on that. So for me, I'll take availability over ability every time and gradually rebuild. And then let's identify these windows. Like let's learn from the COVID-19 situation and apply this to the general training situation and see if we can learn from that to cut down on the overall injury rates in rowing, because this is a potential opportunity to really learn from this and apply it to all the other times in our training year when these transition windows occur. So thanks, and I'm happy to take the general questions on any of this now.
That's great. Well, I think the big message there, and it's a really important one, is how you manage the return. You know, sort of scaling back before you want to get back to normal as soon as possible. And the question that comes up is, you know, if you do start off with some kind of submaximal testing, what indicators are you looking for in order to make a decision on when to do your first max test? You know, so if you've had 8 to 10 weeks off, what are some indicators that the group and the individuals in the group are somewhat back to normal? When is the best time to schedule that first max test?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would probably say after that first 3 to 4 weeks, give the athletes the full 50, 30, 20, 10 time to progress back to their normal workload. And then at this point, beyond week 4, the NSCA says basically resume normal training from this point. So, and I want to pick on one thing you said is like people want to get back to normal as soon as possible. You know, people always worry about that, but why? I would rather use this time to set myself up to go beyond what we did before. So I'm not just worried about, oh, I got to get it back. I'm thinking about like, okay, how can we use this to really set ourselves up to go beyond and make progress here in this next training block, year, whatever you're looking at, not just going back to what you were doing before.
I think Mark Nowak, you know, this is just such a great connection between what Mark has been talking about, you know, for the last, you know, in between when you joined us first and particularly the last month, that the functional movements that you can learn now that will help the return in a systematic way. It's not about more power. It's about being more effective and more functional. So I think that's really good advice. And,
yeah.
and I think this 50, 80, 90 rule is a really interesting one for many of us.
Yep. And again, it's useful because in rowing, we've got the quantifiable volume that we can look to in meters. Look at what you're doing before, take 50% of that. That's your first week back. Then the next week is no more than 70% of that. Then the next week is no more than 80%. It's not, you don't have to rush through all the steps, but it's just putting caps on rowers and coaches. One idea I want to say on this too is that I think that we can backfill our volume with familiar activities. So let's say like familiar cross-training activities, again, that's not a change. So if you go to 50% of your rowing workload, you might not feel like you really got a workout in. We want to still get some aerobic training in because we want to give the musculoskeletal structures time to catch up, but we don't want to go into aerobic detraining. So I think that you could do, if you've been cycling during the shutdown or if you've been walking, whatever it is, you can still backfill your volume with that because that's not going to be a novel stimulus for the body. And
I think, I think the trap with that is what you've got on the first line there is most people think we're going to go over those 4 weeks, and what you've articulated here is volume. It's only volume. There is no indication of intensity or frequency or progression there, and that more often than not, most programs don't have the ability to go from basically in 4 weeks to double the amount of training they're doing.
Yeah.
So it's, if you just had 6 hours a week, how would you just increase the intensity? Not even the frequency and the progression, just keep one variable. That's the only variable, and the discipline to keep that one variable as your moderator, and everything else stays the same. Most people just sort of lump everything. It's creep, you know. There's strength and conditioning piece, there's the cross training, and there's on the water, and there's the erg, you know.
And right, not everybody has the ability to go sculling now, use dynamic ergs during these return phases, use spoon blades, whatever. So then I think, okay, then we are going to focus on, if our per stroke load is going to be relatively consistent, if we're doing mostly low rate work to return with hatchets or static ergs, then okay, we're going to be conservative on the volume, because that's the main factor that we can manipulate here. So again, it's looking at what have we done, what have we prepared for, and what is our own individual situations. Why I'm not trying to say like, here's the Will Ruth plan for return to row, but here's the overall evidence, here's my experience, put it together with your own values and personal situation of your own training situation.
It will, in terms of the various groups that row, right? I mean, do you think is there a different level if you're a master's rower, for instance, and what you want to begin with? Do these numbers still hold for master's rowers, or is this more of a, the more younger junior and collegiate athletes?
Yeah, the National Strength and Conditioning Association with this piece is certainly focused on NCAA, the student athlete demographic. I think that we can, again, until we have more specific guidance on masters populations, on para populations, on rowing specifically, I think that this is sort of the best that we have as far as the best available evidence. The nice thing about using percentages is that it's based on what you were doing before. So if you're a master's rower, maybe you're not doing 100 kilometers a week, maybe you're doing 60 kilometers a week, whatever it is, you're still going to have those progressive increases on your first 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks back, until you're actually going at approaching 100% of what you were doing before, and can build on that.
Yeah, and these are principles, right? So it's just making sense of, okay, what have you done from where you left off to where we're at now, and how do you systematically increase it in a way that makes sense, and that you're not taking a backward step.
Yep.
Because that's inevitably, go back to it and try and do more.
And that's ultimately the value of research for coaches and athletes. I did not read research when I started coaching, and then in my master's program, thanks to our friend Dr. Kuklik and others there at the University of Denver, really tuned into like, wow, there's all of this wealth of knowledge out there of people who have already made all the mistakes that I'm making and learning from in a trial by error process. I recognized, okay, shoot, like if we're seeing more injuries in this first week back, then we've got to be more careful with it. But if it's an eyeball evaluation as a coach of like, oh, I think we're ready to do a little bit more, research offers us like, here's a general principle, apply it, at least start here. Maybe something about your own specific situation. Maybe you've assessed your athletes and wow, we're really far off the mark. Maybe you're not going to do 50%, maybe you're going to do 40%, but at least we've got a starting point for this, thanks to the hard work by all the researchers that I cited in this.
Yep. And even going to the top of the pyramid and the folks at the USOPC, how many conversations we've all had with them to say, what's the fundamental question you want to ask? And as a coach, looking in the whites of an athlete's eye and asking the question, how are you? And really listening to what the athlete response is. And for those athletes that don't have, the luxury of that kind of contact with a coach, to really have mechanisms to accurately look at the progress and say, there's always going to be some level of fatigue, but how do you manage that in some kind of systematic basis where there is time for recovery, but the age-old principle that more is better is not true. It's more is more and better is better. And that's, it doesn't get any more complicated than that. So yeah, really good stuff, Will.
This is really good. I mean, I have numbers, Cam, to apply to my 15 minutes a week of working out. And so I just got to do the math, right? That just comes down to math now at this point. So
I think you're on the 4-hour body program. Wasn't that that's a whole internet sensation?
the 4-hour body or
Yeah.
the
The 4-hour everything, 4-hour work week, 4-hour body, 4-hour everything.
I'm on the 4-bag of Doritos workout is what I've been on. So, but
Well, we're getting
this is
close.
great.
Yeah, we're getting close to the 4-hour webinar.
Yes.
Dialogue.
Yeah,
you
no,
guys
we're
are
there.
nuts.
We're there.
There's a few still on that are in the same boat. So
Everybody, I did send this out, and Will obviously has a great website with loads of information on it, and you can reach out to him. You have his contact. Will, thanks for joining us. I mean, what an important and relevant topic to have today as we're rushing out. So thanks so much for all the work you did to prepare for today and taking all the questions. Let me just see, the one just came in. Let me just see if we have when do we get the hip hinge webinar? It's a coming. Hold on. Let me see if I can get you. Hey, Will.
Yep.
Since we're all of us are here hanging out.
You're gonna book me right now.
I have Saturday the 20th, June 20th free. Do you?
Let's take this offline. At least stop the
Okay.
recording first.
All right.
We'll get it at some point. I might need a webinar break here for a little bit, but
All right. Well, we'll get
but
a
with
anonymous
little-
attendee. We'll get back to you and let
I
you
do-
know when it's up.
I do have, like Chris said, I do have a lot of training resources on my website already. It is rowingstronger.com. I've actually got a whole return to train article that I just sort of walked through with extra information for this presentation. So if you would like to see it all written out and be able to refer to it later, that is there. I've also got a book also called Rowing Stronger, walking through a year of strength training for juniors, masters, collegiate rowers, everybody in between. And I'd be happy to answer more questions about it. I've got videos of the hip hinge and the YWT and stuff on YouTube and stuff. And so I'm definitely happy to talk and or email about it until I can get back on the great webinars.